In making the past present, histories always create absences. When graphic design first became the subject of historical study, the motive was to professionalize the field and make it distinct from its cousins in trade, printing and commercial art. It is against this history that I offer some in-progress research about the life and work of Spencer Thornton Banks. Spencer T. Banks, as he signed his work, was a Black commercial artist who practiced in St. Louis for over 50 years. In sharing his story, I do not seek to fix canonical histories by adding a token biography. Banks' talent was exceptional, but his career indexes a broader narrative about the role of visual communication within the context of racial capitalism in the city deemed the broken heart of America by historian Walter Johnson. St. Louis is the paragon of racial violence, removal, and erasure in U.S. history. St. Louis was the outpost from which the state coordinated indigenous genocide, the site of the Dred Scott decision, and across the river in 1917, where the East St. Louis massacre took place. The Black population of St. Louis increased substantially in the years between World War I and World War II, from 45,000 to 94,000. Racial covenants began prohibiting Black people from living in predominantly white neighborhoods. Black communities were enclosed by white-owned properties to prohibit expansion. Black families often lived in buildings owned by white slumlords who did not maintain the properties, but continued to carve them up into smaller and smaller units. Throughout the 20th century, Black neighborhoods would be razed and its constituents removed in the name of urban renewal. This was the St. Louis that welcomed the Banks family when they arrived in 1926 from Clarksdale, Mississippi. Banks was the only child of Ellis and Eleonora, who were likely sharecroppers. They relocated to St. Louis when Banks was 14. They settled in the Ville, a neighborhood which was likened to Harlem in its flourishing of jazz-age arts and culture. Banks graduated from Sumner High School, the first Black high school west of the Mississippi, in 1932. Banks developed an interest in art by observing illustrated advertisements in his community. These would have reflected the popularity of narrative realism at the time. At Sumner, he likely had the opportunity to study painting and drawing, and before he finished high school, Banks was already receiving commissions. In 1934, Banks painted a large series of die-cut heads for the Amethyst Theater, owned by the cosmetics millionaire Annie Turnbow Malone. In 1939, Banks published a comic strip in the St. Louis Argus, one of two Black newspapers in the city. It was called Pocania, and it told the story of a working girl and her budding romance with Eddie, the manager of a department store. It was the original artboards for Pocania, located in the Modern Graphic History Library at Washington University in St. Louis, that introduced me to Banks. The narrative alone conjures butterflies in the stomach. Banks delightfully captured that fluttering feeling of young attraction. The story ran continuously for many weeks in the newspaper, and each piece built tension between the characters and left the reader curious about what would happen next. But Banks' cartoon strip also evinced a professional class of African Americans, where people fell in love, went out to lunch, and thought about each other over paperwork. This was a more dignified world than the disparaging stereotypes circulating in mainstream white media. Take Hambone's Meditations for contrast. This racist character by J.P. Alley was syndicated nationally from 1916 until 1968. Dressed in rags with exaggerated lips, eyes, and dialect, Hambone was typical of a white gaze that depicted Black men as poor, lazy simpletons. Francis Martin Jr. wrote that such comics allowed whites to avoid accepting Black humanity while actively undermining their rising social status. Hambone's Meditations was canceled after the 1968 Memphis sanitation worker strike and the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. In 1940, Banks married Sarah Richardson, a registered nurse at Homer G. Phillips Hospital, which for a time was the only hospital in St. Louis that would care for African Americans. That same year, Banks enlisted in the U.S. Navy, where he was stationed at Lambert Field during World War II. While in the Navy, Banks developed Joe Boot, a cartoon about an ornery sailor whose gaffes revealed the strict social codes of military life. Joe Boot is viewable by private appointment at the George B. Vachon Museum in St. Louis. The Vachon Museum is the personal collection of Mr. Calvin Riley, a retired educator. Mr. Riley is the single most prolific collector of Spencer Banks' estate, including childhood photos, early drawings and paintings, completed portraits, sketchbooks, and graphic design. I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Riley, and he permitted me to take this photo. He's understandably protective of Banks' legacy, but intends with the right partnership to publish a history of his life so that he will be better known. Banks took classes for several years at People's Art Center, the first integrated institution for arts training in St. Louis, but he was also a teacher himself. He taught lettering and commercial art at Washington Technical High School, and through his own business, Veteran Sign and Art Company, he took in private students. Mr. Riley showed me many photos of Banks working with his students. Here's an example of Banks' own illustration and lettering work, a poster for the championship game of the Negro Baseball Leagues. Banks worked as the art director for the Pine Street YMCA's Y Circus, which raised money to fund scholarships that sent neighborhood children to safe summer camps. The Y Circus was a much anticipated event in the Black community for 2 decades, with headliners like Louis Jordan, Sarah Vaughan, and the Nicholas Brothers. Later in his career, Banks began to compose montage drawings characterized by dramatic scale changes and the integration of hand-lettered texts. This example was a political campaign to save Homer G. Phillips Hospital from demolition. As mentioned, this institution provided medical care to much of St. Louis's Black community, but the hospital was also a symbol of progress and agency. Banks openly lamented this loss as another example of Black removal in this apocalyptic rendering. When I visited the Vachon Museum, Mr. Riley showed me a photograph of Banks' mother, which had an inscription on it in Banks' own handwriting. Eleanora Banks, mother of Spencer T. Banks, American Christian master artist. Perhaps he imagined more of a legacy for himself than he has had. Banks was without a doubt exceptionally talented, but his story also bears witness to a particular context, one in which exuberant representations of Black cultural life reflect an enduring people within the racist context of 20th century St. Louis. Thank you.